Welcome to the first lecture for the Autumn 2015 Baumer Lecture Series at the Knowlton School. My name is Andrew Cruz. I'm an assistant professor in the architecture section and also the chair of this year's Baumer Lecture Series. Before introducing tonight's speaker, Sarah Oppenheimer, I want to say a few words about the lecture series and the theme this semester of energies. Metaphorical energies power discourse just as literal energies power buildings, cities, and landscapes. The Autumn 2015 Baumer Lecture Series aims to address both the metaphorical and literal senses. To the typical cast of characters, architects, landscape architects, city and regional planners, we hear from an artist, a physician, and an engineer. Together they will bring new enthusiasms, new energies to debates and discussions around the Knowlton School. This autumn's Baumer series also addresses the relationship to energy in a literal way. Many of the fall speakers will make the relationship of energy and design explicit and will demonstrate the richness and render it vital. The message here is that energy can be shocking and that we should embrace this discomfort, whether in the form of stepping out of disciplinary boundaries or modes of thinking. Sarah Oppenheimer's work and her presence here at Knowlton fit squarely within this idea. Sarah is a visual artist based in New York, whose work examines how we perceive and move through space through often geometrically driven interior installations. In her work, one's perception of a space is shifted from the customary distraction to one of engagement, puzzlement, and wonder. Sarah's work has been shown nationally and internationally, and among other institutions, the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Andy Warhol Museum and Mattress Factory, Art Basel, and the Sculpturhus in Stockholm. She's currently working on a solo exhibition at the Wexner Center for the Arts that's scheduled to open in winter of 2017. Parallel to her lecture tonight, she's leading a workshop of art and architecture students that will help in the development of that show. And you're welcome on Friday to come to the gallery space in Knowlton under the stairs to look at some of the work that the students have produced. Finally, I want to thank the Wexner Center for the Art and the director, Sherry Gelden, who's looking for a seat in the back, for co-sponsoring tonight's lecture. And thank you to the installation crew who just graciously let us walk through the galleries. They're in the last days of an installation of a show that will open on Friday. With that, please join me in welcoming Sarah Oppenheimer.
Thank you very much for coming. And I want to say a few words about the significance of this moment in relationship to what you will see in tonight's talk. And I also want to talk about how that relates to very specific people who are in this room this evening. I see this talk as a really extraordinary moment. In some ways, it serves as a kind of marker or break. As Andrew pointed out, I am in the process with a number of really extraordinary collaborators of developing a project at the Wexner, and I want to talk very specifically about who those collaborators are. But to stay very focused, I think that collaboration is proving to become and grow into a much broader strain of questions in the work that my studio is developing. And that largely has to do with understanding, I think the topic of this lecture series is very apt, understanding space as a kind of location for possible flow or conductivity, and to think of the work as operating as some kind of switch that can reroute different sorts of material and immaterial action. With that in mind, the workshop that we are developing in tandem with this exhibition at the Wexner is in many ways due to the extraordinary energy of Andrew Cruz, who's been very, very involved in the project, and I'd like to thank you for that process. It's also and extraordinarily indebted to the entire staff of the WEX, particularly Sherry Yeldon, the director, who's here this evening. Thank you, Sherry. And to Lucy and Megan and Jill, who is not currently here, and the list is very, very long. I also want to thank Rika Jorgensen and Naomi Maki, who are here tonight, who are here to both develop this project at the WEX, but also to work with the folks at the Knowlton and in the School of Art to kind of expand our understanding of the Wexner as a site, as a location, as a context for some kind of action. And finally, I want to say a huge thank you to 3 new, likely and perhaps possibly definitively confirmed collaborators on this project, which are coming from the School of Engineering. I'm incredibly excited to be working with you guys. So thank you over there, Blaine Lilly, Sandra Meltzer, and Laura in the back. So thank you very much, and I'm going to dive into the problem of how we might think about the possibility of developing a switch within a network of space. But I'm probably only going to get there, if I get there at all, at the very, very tail end of this talk. So in some ways, the entire talk is a preamble for what we are working on in developing the website.
That mic apparently sounds terrible. Can we use this one?
Yeah,
instead?
sure. Okay, so I'm going to work on speaking into a microphone, which I'm not always very good at. So what we have here, actually, let's see if this works. Okay, what we have here on this slide is we have a line. And I like to think of this line as a boundary between here and there, a boundary between one side of the screen and the other side of the screen. It's a divider or division. And in some ways, we could start the questions of this talk as how do we deal with the relationship between space A on one side of this line and space B on the other side of the line. But I want to complicate that to some extent, and I want to think about actually what precisely is happening not in space A or in space B, but in that very tense liminal relationship between them. I want to think about that space as having a kind of thickness that can be understood as perhaps not simply a border condition or a boundary condition, but as a location that one can occupy, that one can manipulate, and that could in fact be seen as a site of great potential, which allows for differences and changes to happen from one zone to another. This very simple problem of a boundary condition between, let's say, one side of the screen and the other side of the screen, or one side of the wall and the other side of the wall, or one side of the building and the other side of the building, gets more complicated when we start to understand space as having a more sort of complex arrangement. Specifically, I like to think of the arrangement of these locations as an array. And I have some very basic tenets about the array that I'd like to outline. First, space is divided. Second, spatial boundaries result from conventions of architectural and urban context. For example, materials and dimensions of interior space are prescribed by industrial relations and code requirements. Such contextual determinants create uniformity in the division of space, public courtyards, corporate lobbies, hallways, rooms, etc. This regular division is the array. 3. The array goes largely unnoticed. Much like user-friendly software, it ubiquitously naturalizes the dynamics of spatial division. The array constitutes a spatial authority, creating conditions that invite rupture within the pattern progression space. 4. Habitation of the array is time-based, a flow embodied by a moving, active, stereoscopic agent. Inhabitants experience the array over a period of time. 5. Memory knits the temporal chain into a cogent spatial map. Perceived conflict within this mnemonic map heightens the experience of spatial continuity. Here we have multiple possibilities of the organization of an array. So for example, we could have space A next to space B, or space A, space B, and space C also adjacent on a single plan, or we can understand this central drawing as, in fact, a section where A and B are stacked on top of C. And similarly, we could see A, B, and C, D as an array laterally, or as a vertical arrangement. This progression gets more complex when we start thinking of space in a three-dimensional set of coordinates. Particularly, you'll start to notice anomalies in some of these stacked systems. So, for example, we may have an AB, an ABC, and in the center here an ABCD condition, but you'll notice that that thickness becomes a site of potential. So, for example, this may be the standard intersection, but here we have an intersection that proves almost impossibly thin. And that thinness, just as that thickness, starts to become a site of work. But it's very important, I believe, for us to think about these boundaries as not necessarily material ones. It is better to understand, these boundaries are better understood as discrete zones defined by a set of relations. Here, for example, we can understand a boundary between two spaces, the space of this sort of white ray system and the dark wedge, as defined by the limit of the visible from any single spatial location. Urban planners have long been interested in the sightlines available within an urban context. In the 60s and 70s, planners developed a diagrammatic tool named the isovist. This tool describes the field of surrounding space visible from any given point, assuming 360-degree vision from a single position in space. Here, in this diagram, the isovist is articulated as a two-dimensional array equally determined by the position of viewing and the including contours of the white square. The concept is extremely useful in understanding, for example, how new development in a downtown might affect the visibility of an existing landmark building, or how much of a park can be taken in from a particular spot within its terrain. As the body moves around this occluding object, you'll notice that the shape or the form of the isovist changes over time. The study of the visual field can be seen here in a virtual reality experiment developed by Dr. William Baumer. This experiment explores the relationship between visual field cues and a mnemonic map. Test subjects are asked to navigate a complex virtual topiary maze. At certain junctures, there are holes in the plan, not dissimilar to what one finds, for example, in Pac-Man, meaning they are wandering through a virtual reality maze. They come against one edge of the maze, and instead of finding themselves in some continuous 3D environment, they actually are dropped back into the maze on the far side. Now, test subjects were asked to draw cognitive maps of this location, of this topiary maze. And the thing that was most striking in terms of Dr. Baumer's findings was that, in fact, because there was temporal continuity in navigating this virtual space, they experienced spatial continuity as well, meaning they experienced screen left as actually continuous with screen right. This, of course, can be understood also when one thinks about games like Portal, where in fact, rather than occupying the sort of omniscient position of the viewer in Pac-Man, where you look down on the plan view or at the elevation of the game, you're here immersed in a perspectival environment, and you lose the rudder of exactly how spaces are linked and how they are not linked. Conversations with Dr. Warren resulted in a host of different developments in my work, but in particular, it evolved into thinking about how one could disrupt this mnemonic procession, how one could set up a set of relationships whereby that temporal chain that is a result of wandering through some space is suddenly or abruptly met with some kind of discontinuity. I became interested in this and used Dr. Warren's language as a framework, and he refers to this as a wormhole. A wormhole in the material world, or in this framework, operates as follows. Let's say you inhabit this cube, and you have to move from this cube around this horseshoe space to this cube. Well, it takes a certain amount of time. And as you navigate it, that time starts to feel like it is a direct result of a certain distance. But in fact, if you encountered this cube initially with a hole to this cube, you would understand the distance between the 2 points entirely differently. This is even more the case when we think about how spaces might operate vertically. How frequently do we think about the space just beyond this wall versus the space that is directly over our heads or the space that is directly beneath our feet? This project, completed in 2008, was a project that really played with that problem. You entered a small enclosed room, and there was a depression in the floor plane. As you moved closer to that depression, you started to feel a kind of air change coming from the opening in the ground. When you take the elevator to the floor below, you see the extension of the work through the floor and out the window on the 3rd floor of the building. And this is an impossible view from the building exterior. The possibility of understanding two spaces as somehow simultaneously visible became increasingly interesting to me over time. And I started to imagine that we could both understand our own location and the location beyond some sort of physical boundary simultaneously. This was set up in the following manner. Here we have a situation where the white represents the poche of a dividing wall, and the dark area is a void space between it. A figure stands on one side of the wall, or in space A, and a second figure stands in space B, and there's a direct sight line between these two locations. However, affixed to the surfaces of this opening are two mirrors, which creates a double reflection, or a periscope-like reflection from space A to space B, but there is a direct sight line that passes through the center of that opening, creating a kind of inversion spatially. That inversion is entirely dependent on the distance of the viewer to the reflective surface. So if the viewer is standing, say, 40 feet away from that wall plane or boundary plane, you'll notice that here, this reads as almost a double image, because the angle of viewing, or the angle of sight as it hits that mirror and bounces back down, basically is far closer to parallel than to the direct sight line that's happening in the center of the work. So this is the reflected image, and this is the direct image. As the viewer gets closer to that boundary plane, or the visitor gets closer, the person one is viewing gets closer to the boundary plane, there becomes a sort of inversion, whereby what is above is seen below, and what is below is seen above. extended as I started to think about how one might imagine the space of this boundary as an expanded or inhabitable zone. So instead of this becoming simply an A-B condition, it quickly changed to become an A-B-C condition, where we have space A, space B, and then a space buried within the thickness of the wall, which was a small elevated room above. Here you look through the floor plane of the room above at a room beyond, and you look through a second opening, or an opening in a second opening in a single voided volume to the space above. This is the upper room of that piece, so what you're actually viewing is the lower portion of the body. And this is space A. Here we are looking at people above, and here we are looking through the floor plane of these individuals to the space beyond. And there we are solely seeing the people in the room above. I also began to be interested in how this plane or this boundary field might not necessarily have be vertical in relation to the body or perpendicular to the floor plane. And I was interested in thinking about how this plane could in fact occupy multiple positions simultaneously. It could be a wall, a vertical wall plane. It could also slope and become a kind of extended floor plane. And similarly, this plane could be understood to have a kind of thickness or body to it. It could be disrupted and doubled through its shifting angle. Here we have an image of a work that occupied this sort of twisted location, and you'll see here it looks as though it is sort of landing here, but in fact the entire piece is cantilevering off a beam that's about 10 feet deep in this wedge of space that's created. And there are two discrete openings that pass through the thickness of it. Out through this wall, beyond this wall, is an air shaft into central London. So you'll see that in a moment. One thing that's very hard to tell from looking at these pictures, but I think is of critical importance, is that, and for those of you who are familiar with photography, this won't be surprising, the light temperature, the color of the white light in these photographs is very confusing, because in fact the gallery had a warm tungsten light and the exterior had a very cool white light. And that's very much lost because the photos were shot with strobes. So as you'll see as I talk a bit more about future projects, that light temperature is increasingly important to how this boundary between exterior and interior is evolving. So this brings me back to our dear friend the Isovist and the possibility of thinking about this array as an inhabitable space. And also thinking about this array as something that has characteristics that both limit and extend your vision. Here I was presented with a location that was comprised of 5 adjacent spaces, A, B, C, D, E, in plan. And these spaces were actually built out around a very specific column grid for the building. Here we have column 1, and a second column was buried inside of this wall. And I was very interested in thinking about how the navigation of this space was affected by this column grid, a problem that persists very strongly in how we're thinking about the possibilities of creating a project for the Wexner. So with that in mind, I returned to the problem of the Isovist, but the problem of the Isovist now became a problem of variables. It became a problem of the change, how does the change of position of the body and the change of the building envelope interact? And because of that, it became very, very important to understand specifically how these columns affect the volume of space in which the body finds itself. I wanted to understand the isovist as a volumetric form. Working in collaboration with a programmer, I developed a custom script for our digital modeling software. The use of scripting is central to the procedural logic of my work. All digital models are clusters of numerical coordinates within a Cartesian matrix. Parametric scripting assigns relative value to those coordinates, creating a set of interdependent variables. For example, variable A, the height of an object, can be scripted to be dependent on variable B, the width of an object. Any modification of the height will automatically modify the width. This principle can be applied to any numeric value within the system. So, for example, the location of a light source can be dependent on the time of day, or, as in the case of the isofist definition, the volume of the isofist is dependent on the relationship between the total architectural volume and the position of the viewer. This is a quick example of the isofist definition, but the software automatically updates the isofist in real time as the point of viewing is moved around in the space. So here we have our volume, our non-divided array. We're loading that volume into our definition. And then we're loading our point of viewing into our definition. And we can readily see the volume of space that comprises our isovist, correct? Now, in this instance, we're only looking at the position of viewing, but you'll see that as the viewer moves, that isovist is constantly changing or updating. And so the space can be shaped around the volume of that viewing location. And that viewing location and that boundary condition of the visible can become our new interior wall boundary system. So to return to the problem of the isovist as it applies to this project, one of the major challenges, as you can see from that very simple schematic video, is that this column, which is floating out there in B, is creating a very, very strong boundary condition that's constantly in flux as one moves through it, and thereby is in some ways a primary driver of how one experiences this location. The way that was resolved in this project was by shifting the grid ever so slightly so that we moved from an A, B, C, D, E space to an A, B, C, D, E, F space by burying those columns inside the interior walls. But what was of great importance to this particular project was that these columns or masses did not land in the intersection of those walls, and in fact left these spaces, these intersecting grid lines, open as a place of work. Also, because this grid space, or this arrangement of spaces, was slightly offset from one another, the grid space between them, in fact, created these very irregular conditions that were not the same from this intersection to this intersection. I also started to think about how, in fact, we could understand this boundary condition, and this goes back to the original discussion of how perhaps we understand boundaries as immaterial, how this boundary condition could be understood as a result of light conditions. So, for example, if now we understand this point as a light source, we can see that this is darkness and this is illumination, and the body is actually passing through these divided zones without necessarily being impeded by a physical barrier. In thinking that through, I started to develop a series of models that were light-based models. And one of the things you may be very aware of is that light is beautifully scalable, meaning you can study light in a model situation and you can scale that light up, and you don't actually have the loss of definition or change of saturation. To do that, we made a series of light models with a set of kind of standardized Kelvin value fluorescent bulbs. The bulbs were all exactly the same Kelvin value, and they were all the same brand, and the light fixtures were all the same brand. And that allowed us to kick the light from warm to cool using a set of theatrical gels and control the warm and cool within each of the 6 spaces. This is a simple table for that sort of translation to occur. You'll notice here we have the starting position of our light source, which was 3000. And we were basically taking a 3000 Kelvin value bulb, and we were trying to kick it to cool daylight, which is 7, or towards a warm incandescent, let's say 2000. And we were basically applying gels that intersected with these vectors that corresponded with these light changes. We then made a series of kind of walkthroughs of this model, where many instances were studied. And one of the things that I think is really fascinating about this is that it's almost impossible to have a kind of digital analogy, in that, in fact, to actually visibly be there and see how light is interacting with another light source is very different than watching a kind of constant updating ray tracing or radiosity software. The result of the piece was basically based on a series of intersecting grids that intersected the existing grids of the system. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the materiality of this work as it carries through into the next several works I'm going to discuss. The piece was constructed out of a very matte black anodized aluminum, and the anodized aluminum was used specifically because it was very light absorbent and also because it was extremely rigid. And I was interested in creating a seamless, or actually not a seamless, an articulated seam between the planes of material when they join together. But I was also interested in that becoming a very muted condition. So it was visible, but it was not actually disrupting the matteness and light absorbency of that larger surface. To do that, I also used a series of customized scripts, Baumer scripts, and that had to do with applying some woodworking lap joint development into metalworking and metal milling. So here we have a series of different types of lap joints which could be applied to joining of 2 aluminum plates. And here we have a definition that was developed for that purpose. So one of the very nice things here is that obviously there were a series of variables that interacted with that, some of which had to do with the length of that lap joint, some of which had to do with the width of the lap joint, some of which had to do with the radius of the router bit, and also some of which had to do with the rhythm of this joint over time. So one of the things you'll see, and I'll point out in the next few projects, is the differences in this joint, in the plate-to-plate joints. All of the joint was developed through the same scripts. This is our bit radius slider. This is an early sample of the joint. It was a flip milled element, so registration on the milling bed was an issue. And this is a different sample. And this was what I refer to as a 3-way joint. It's a single bent plate with a third plane or a second piece of material that slots into it. And this detail is visible in this tiny little junction right here in this upper corner. So we're now in the space of this piece that you enter. And as you enter, you'll notice this is extremely blue. The reason this space here is so blue is because there is a window and it's daylit. So in the case of these photographs, the color is now color balanced, neutral to the room the photograph is taken in. So the room will always appear neutral, which will kick other rooms warm and other rooms cool around it. This is turning around that corner. This is once you pass through that corner, you're now looking out that window. This is the view from the back, the opposite side of that entry wall. And this is a view back towards that, basically the window is at your back here, and you're looking back towards that view through the window. This piece was very, very important in my thinking about using large planes of glass. And one of the things that I thought was extremely interesting about this piece was how this glass did not contact the floor. And you'll see that as something that recurs. How does the glass edge deal with the floor? How is the load of the glass then transferred onto the ground? All of those things I think are really, really interesting and complicated problems. Here we have an example of one joint, a different joint in the piece. So the next project I'm going to discuss was a project that was commissioned as a permanent part of a building, and it was commissioned at the time of a building renovation where the contemporary wing of the Baltimore Museum was actually being renovated, but the other sections of the museum were not. And I was asked to make a work that sort of bridged two actually spatially entirely discrete zones of the museum, and thereby engage with a kind of public atrium space, which I think is a kind of bizarre mandate that one needs to take an empty zone and fill it. But I think that was the initial impulse behind the conversation. And I became very interested not so much in this fillable emptiness, but actually in the boundaries that happen between the empty atrium zone and in particular, the contemporary wing of the museum. So what I'm going to show you now is a section through this location, and there is a spiral staircase that allows you to enter here. You walk up, stand on a landing, enter here, and then you walk through the second story here. Alternatively, you can walk directly from this entry through this circular cylinder and into the main contemporary wing, which is on the ground floor of this space. So here we have walking directly. You enter, you walk under the landing on the spiral stair, and you're in the space below. Or you take the spiral staircase up, you stand on that landing, and then you walk around and you enter the second floor of the contemporary wing. And this was the state of the space as I found it, or as I was invited to participate in it. And you'll notice that there was a very thick slab here, and there was a sight line that was a direct sight line out into this public atrium space. The shift in this array was very minor. We made a hole in the slab and reinforced that with a set of steel beams, and then we created an opening and a thickening of this boundary wall, which generated a series of new and relayed sight lines between the contemporary galleries. In studying this, the problem became, how do we think about an isovist if we're also dealing with the potential of reflection? So, for example, here we have a series of people standing in the upper, let's call it the upper gallery, and the question was, how do we measure the sight lines that happen from the people in the upper gallery reflected across a mirror at 45 degrees down to the people on the first floor of the building? All of the individuals that are red are individuals who are unable to see through down to the second floor. And the reason they're unable to see through to the second floor is very simple. It's that these sight lines are actually intersecting with the thickness of that hole, the depth of that slab. So all of these red vectors are actually intersecting with the side of this opening. Because of that, it became very obvious, you'll see the number of red individuals is increasing here, it became very obvious that the actual surface of the opening had to become central to the visual arrangement of this project. To do that, we developed an isovist that was a very simple modification, or an isovist script. It was a very simple modification of the previous script, which simply meant that we reflected the geometry of, like the self-geometry over or across the mirror plane, and then we observe the isovis that was generated through that reflective surface. When you actually encounter the artwork, you'll see that most of the artwork is in fact black. And part of that black is a direct view onto this matte aluminum surface, and the other part of the black is a reflected view of that matte aluminum surface. So here when you enter the piece, it appears to be a kind of glowing monochrome. And as you move around it, you start to see an opening through to the atrium beyond, which is extraordinarily blue because it is daylit. And as you continue to move across this wall, you start to see a second trapezoid of space emerging from the, let's say, right of your screen. And it is extremely yellow because it is a gallery incandescent lit space. Actually, I think it's halogen. And when it's occupied by people, you start to understand the relationships of the bodies that are actually inhabiting the spaces above and below. Here you can see the interior of the space. This is a reflective mirror surface. And here we're seeing a reflection of one of the joints. Here you can see, unlike the prior piece, these joints are very, very kind of large and thick. It was done in exactly the same way. We use the same code to develop the detail. And this is the work from the ground floor walking beneath it. And when you're looking up from the lower floor, you see people looking down or looking at the art around them. The interest in the possibility of a glass plane as a carrier of light became more and more central to how this work has evolved. And I started to think that perhaps we didn't need to have two openings, or a reflective and a non-reflective surface, but we could use the amount of light that hits a surface as a way of thinking about transmission or sharing multiple spaces on the same screen. So here, the question was, how can we see space A and space B projected on the same surface simultaneously? Here we have a diagram of how that works, or how that will work in the next slide. Space A, space B. We are looking aerially, so this is a person, this is their head and shoulders. This is a thick wall with a lot of poche, or stuff in there that is not visible. And here we have an opening, basically a box, that passes through from A to B. And here we have this double thin line. This double thin line is a piece of coated glass. It's kind of standard architectural coating, which has a certain reflectancy. You'll notice that if this glass has black behind it, which let's assume it does in this instance, when this viewer looks at that, because there's black behind the glass, it reflects out to the space over here. And when the viewer stands, assuming these two spaces are equally lit, in the center and looks directly through the glass, then in fact, or there's nothing behind it, they are able to see directly through to the opposite side. But there is a certain point as one looks at the piece where, as they see the piece, there is black reflecting from, there's black behind it, which creates a reflection, but what is reflected is the black surface in front of it. And what that creates is the illusion of a stable boundary between the two fields of A and B. So here is the work. When you view it from a steep angle on the side, it's just a clear piece of glass. You look directly through it. But as you move around it, you start to see both sides simultaneously. You see the space behind you, and you see the space through the piece. And here we see the boundary of the reflection of the interior surface of that wall. And that actually stays quite stable as you move around the work. The possibility of using light levels to think about reflectivity and transparency is the primary impulse behind this next and last work I'm going to talk about tonight. This piece was created for a building that had two very distinct building grids at work, not unlike the Wexner, but resulting from a very different historical impulse than the Wexner. There was a long, let's say, horizontally axis gallery, and then there was a set of walls that intersected the gallery at approximately 45 degrees. I was interested in extending those grid lines, which brought this 45-degree axis in contact with this long open space, which was the site of the artwork. And in particular, I wanted to think about how these walls or these barriers could sort of create a set of zones, but also could start to address the extreme sidedness, the illumination sidedness of this space. So there was a lot of daylight that would pour in from this side of the space and filter towards this side of the space. So as you walked along this corridor, you were constantly being drawn out to one side of your body because all of the light was kind of coming in through that field. Initially, in thinking this through, I thought, oh, well, we can do this with a series of lights. Let's build a series of light models and see how that works. But the problem became that the daylight always overwhelmed the artificial light. And there was no way, in fact, to balance that artificial light and balance the daylight by adding more and more artificial light. Because of that, I started to think not so much in terms of color temperature, but actually in terms of how we could control light levels within each of the zones. So here you'll see we have a darker zone, a lighter zone, and a darker zone. And part of the way that was developed was by thinking about the relationship of this wall surface to these windows. One side of the wall is facing the window and so is bright, and one side of the wall is facing away from the window and is dim. Here we have a simple drawing of the space. It's a long corridor-like space with a ton of light coming in from one wall. And here we have the walls that were built into the space as an extension of the neighboring grid. And the reason for this double line is simply to indicate the bright and dark side of these wall surfaces. For this wall surface, the bright side faces these windows, and the dim side faces the central space. And for this double wall surface, so 1, 2, we have a very bright space in this small corner, and then all of these other walls are facing away from the light source and so are darker. And within this already sided light situation, we inserted two large pieces of glass. And the glass had the same property, meaning there was a bright side of the glass and a dim side of the glass. So here we have a bright side of the glass facing this window, and a dim side of the glass facing the opposite direction. And similarly here, we have a bright side of the glass facing the window, and a dim side of the glass facing the opposite direction. And what I'd like to point out is, if you have a very illuminated side of the glass, it will act as a mirror. So whenever you stand here in this zone, if you are looking at that glass, it will bounce your sight line 45 degrees out of the space. Or if you're standing in this zone, you'll look through this dark side of the glass to the bright side of the glass. It'll bounce your sight line out. And similarly here, you'll look through the dark side and bounce your sight line out. Here you're looking through the dark side, bouncing off the bright side. And what that starts to do is create a really unusual isovist situation. Because the isovist is in flux, it is now not solely dependent on the position of the viewer, it's also dependent on the position of the light in relation to the viewer, in relation to the position of the glass. So this is the view as you enter. You're looking at the darker side of the glass at the darker side of the wall. And you're looking through that darker side of the glass at a brighter side of the other glass, which is down here, and it's bouncing your view out a set of windows on the left. And then when you are in the center of this space, you can look at that first bounce here, or you can turn 180 degrees, and what was just transparent will have become reflective. And now you can understand some of these relationships. There's a person outside. There is this large piece of glass. You'll notice something that I was extremely interested in is that this glass is floating above the ground line, and that this is at 90 degrees to our wall surface, which creates a kind of extension of this wall plane through the glass. And here we're looking in the opposite direction, back towards the initial entry space. This is a detail of our glass connection, which actually becomes a kind of shark fin of sorts and is picked up by a clamp that's buried inside of the wall thickness to prevent the glass from shifting from side to side or rotating. And here you can see very pronouncedly, because we are on such a bright surface, the extension of this reveal at the floor as it extends into this corner. So in closing, I'd like to talk a bit about what might be perhaps some of the implications of such a project. The boundaries delimiting our built environment could be understood as invisible, opaque, and impossibly thin. They can also be understood to embody an incredibly broad and expansive set of questions that engage both the organization of space and the organization of information flow. Contemporary art institutions often rely on archives of digital files such as construction documents, capacity studies, light and temperature analysis, etc. Computer-aided design allows for this information and proposed alterations to the built environment to be shared between parties without material consequence. The studio's use of Rhino, CAD, scripting, etc. allows for a scalable practice that integrates with these particular contemporary conditions. This integration into conventions of information flow raises a central question regarding the possibilities of institutional engagement. Architecture is a determining characteristic of contemporary art. The spaces of exhibition, the logic of their operation, and the iconic public face of the museum increasingly determine forms of new work, often fabricated specifically for display in museum galleries. Light projection and performance are remarkably scalable and adaptable to the architectural envelope, well suited to vast spaces with relatively small budgets. Institutional engagement is often minimized and context is erased by live bodies and moving images. The procedural method of digital architecture shares the scalable possibilities of light projection and performance, but it also deviates at key points. By adopting the procedural methods of architecture, an artwork is able to operate within an evolved, pre-existing codified system of information flow and material manipulation. Engagement arises precisely at the moment that the invisible rules underpinning the architectural envelope are questioned. Importantly, this is not limited to the symbolic realm of building code, flow studies, and structural requirements. This symbolic system is materially manifest in the inhabitation of architecture. Spatial reconfiguration has the potential to transform this symbolic exchange into an experiential reality, allowing agents to reconsider their location within the architectural context. Thank you. Yeah, totally. And you can turn this off if you want.
This off or this off?
This, I don't know. Thank you.
We have time for some questions. You're an endless font of questions.
Yeah.
Just something curious.
Can we keep it quiet in the back so we can hear the questions?
A lot of them are views from within a space and they look outward into another space. I was curious if you would ever explore maybe being at the street level and looking into architecture somehow and then looking out again.
That's such a great question.
Raise your hand if you ask it. You can know if you're an art student or an architecture student, whether I should be happy with you or mad at you.
Architecture,
Okay,
be mad if you want.
Well, the thing that I think is interesting about that question is that in some ways, this last project that's here assumed that the entire long corridor space was the thickness of that wall. So all of the light interactions happened in that space, but now instead of simply looking from one side to the other side, you could inhabit that location. And one thing you can't see from this, but was very central to the development of this piece, was that there were a series of views that were very specific from the exterior of the building. But the problem I found with that is a light levels issue, and it's also a time issue, but it's a great problem that I haven't yet explored, which is that because glazing, as we all know, is highly reflective from the brighter side, it's almost always brighter during the daytime hours from the exterior. So really, when you look at buildings, you're often looking at mirrors, and it takes a shift in light conditions, a backlighting of the building or an interior lighting of the building to change that viewing condition. And yeah. Yes.
You spoke early on about how you saw this boundary between the A and B space and that you wanted to thicken the interstitial space and make use of that. But I was curious how you thought by creating that as a semi-third space, you start to create additional additional boundaries at those two ends. So instead of having one infinitely small boundary, you actually have four. The more you start adding different spaces to.
I think that's a great question, and I think it points us, and I know that you are diving into a 3-day-long workshop with us, towards a change in the frame of the question, which is that rather than thinking of this as a space that is empty, right, or we could call it a hole, or we could call it a lot of things, that we think of it as a switch. And a switch is a complicated device that instead of thinking of it as having, let's say, a single surface or multiple surfaces, we think of it as an operation. What is that operation doing between space A and space B? So yes, you are correct. There are many things shoved in that zone, and those many things are doing different things within that zone, but they're also opening up a kind of flow between the zone. This flow of sight lines, a flow of motion, a flow of all sorts of things. And I think I'm interested in thinking about the control of that flow as a material thing, not as an immaterial thing. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question about kind of from where you're getting this question out of the dotted line. I know, so in the original surveying documents, there's a line between Tennessee and Georgia, and in that line, like the thickness of that line on the map drawn, actually represented some amount of space in the states, and it's a continuous problem to this day over which state that part of the line actually belongs to. So it's a historic problem in some sense. So I'm just kind of curious as to from where you're deriving your interest originally.
So I think that's a really beautiful question, because it points to the potential, it points to the time of the formation and the politics that are so deeply embedded in the formation of these boundaries. And there are the kind of micro-politics of an institution where there's a private and a public, there's the macro-politics of larger global conditions, all of which I think are extremely important in that shifting location. But I also think that my work grows out of a very specific interest in a set of questions that evolved in the very recent history of contemporary art, and not quite so recent history of contemporary art. And that has to do with how institutions subdivide and what is visible and not visible. So I'll just point you towards a project that has been very influential in my own thinking. There was a piece made by Michael Asher, often in a number of contemporary art institutions. They'll rebuild walls for different shows constantly. And if you visit the Wexner regularly, you'll see the constantly changing plan. It's actually a fascinating maneuver. But what he did was he basically rebuilt all of the walls of a given institution in all of the positions they've occupied for the history of the entire institution, but they were just stud walls. So you saw through them, but you suddenly saw this, precisely what you're describing, this history of shifting boundaries between location, and possibly you might have some insight into the politics of those and power plays of those choices. Jeffrey.
You so far have said brilliant, incredible, and beautiful. So this is just going to this is going to be a WTF. How dare you ask that question? Just so, for your sake and for my sake, we've met. It's important to me. I'm not saying it needs to be important to everybody else or to you that I approach your work as art, not architecture. And I love the way it relates to architecture. And I think we spoke about this earlier. All of my students at SciArt got incredibly interested in this work and became obsessed with it at my suggestion. And then I had to teach a semester-long course about why this wasn't architecture. I mean, it's really an incredibly interesting adventure for me. This happened right after we met. But one of the things I love about the work is it's neorealism. And the fact that it's not too afraid to use effects that original realistic art, like it will use reflection, it will use illusionistic effects because they are true properties of material in certain relationships. And so I think its obsession with measurement, a kind of scientific approach to its rigor is incredibly important. And so I have two questions. One is, do you expect the rigor on the part of the audience to, in other words, it takes a lot of work, because I know this for a fact, I have now gone to see almost every word it's possible to go see. It takes a lot of work to reproduce the desired effect of the work on the part of the audience that you have gone into build the process. It takes work. You have to plan to know what to see. And you have to exert a lot of effort to see it. And so it takes preparation, time, and effort to actually see what your process is hoping you will see in detail. So you can see it in passing interest and sort of that you get parts of it, you get part of it. A lot of it is a kind of a sense of spectacle at kind of, wow, that's incredible. The whole range of experiences. So that's part one of the question, out of respect. Part two of it is something I'm really interested in. Your work goes beyond borrowing or appropriation. It confiscates aspects of its surroundings into itself in ways that many art wouldn't allow itself. So it uses the outside, it uses other people, it uses other paintings on a wall, it uses other artworks. And I was okay with that until Robert Motherwell's elegy to the Spanish Civil War came up. And that really bothered me.
Wow.
In a sense, because it is a piece that uses almost the same language, black and white, geometry, in order to get to a very, very deep poetic, in other words, absolutely not a neo-realism. I just wondered in that one particular, this is now a personal question. So the way the artworks behave in relationship to your confiscation and appropriation and their framing works, does that matter?
So I'm going to respond to this first question. I also think is a fascinating question, but I want to respond to the second question because I think it's sort of a challenge, but I think it's a challenge that requires both a suspension of disbelief, but also a belief in something else, which is I think that I'm extremely interested in the idea of the contamination of the autonomy of the artwork. I think that all of this work, and this is perhaps why I brought up an artist like Asher, but there are many artists of certain, historically, who have been, and also I think Renaissance-based artists is a fascinating idea about how there is a kind of erasure of the architectural context or the space around it, so that in some ways the artwork becomes entirely dependent and constitutive of the context.
I am too, since I've sent you that exhibition. Yeah.
And so to say something about the Motherwell, because I think that's a very acute observation and one that I actually really like, which is that when these, and I have, there are works I've not shown here, but in the process of thinking through this work, I have had the occasion of working at different encyclopedic museums. So I did a project with the curator at St. Louis Art Museum where we were able to basically go through the works that were in the museum and think about the work and hang works in relation to the projects that I was making. And I made a very clear decision after that project, and I think that's part of why that project is not part of this conversation, that I did not want to do that again. And the reason I did not want to do that again is because I was extremely interested in the fact that these spaces are inhabited, that these spaces are inhabited by conversations. They're not just inhabited by objects and by people and by politics and by all sorts of things. They're also inhabited by a whole wealth of intellectual debates and very, very serious conversations. And I wanted my work to talk about its relation to the world without making the stakes of those pieces, which have their own agenda, obviously, without curating the agenda of those pieces. And so that was a decision by the curator, and I say yes.
First question?
First question. Briefly, you are correct. It takes time. And in the back.
So, given that this is a mixed audience, it's a really broad question, but how do you feel about the delineation between like design and art and architecture? In your experience with the people you've worked with and the things you've made, is that like legitimate, or is it all malarkey for us to just segregate ourselves unnecessarily?
Well, I think that's a great question. I think it's an important question in this context, because in some ways this is a really extraordinary opportunity for us as a group to think about problems as they may disciplinarily bleed into each other. I think insofar as I understand a very clear distinction, is I think there is a very clear historical set of terms which are different. And I think that that's fascinating, but also it means that working with or against those terms has to do with where that work is defined and how that work is circulating. I'll be really specific about it. So let's talk about perspective for a minute. And this truth to materials, the possibility of reflection, optics, light conditions. In the field of art, I would say that is extraordinarily, that has been strongly dismissed. I mean, there's a show that's opening 2 nights from now, which is a really fascinating show. I think everyone should go see it, called After Picasso. I mean, Picasso, since 12, 13, maybe even much earlier, the possibility of perspective as a central idea in art making is really very specious. Whereas in architecture, and I would say particularly given the use of things like CAD/CAM software, perspective has never seen such a wealth of believers. I mean, my God. So that's just an example of how historical technological trajectories come together and move apart.
Question about, it's kind of, I guess, more of a simple question. I saw the piece you showed earlier in the slideshow, some of the work that I've seen just in researching in the past, that you were using wood paneling, and then a lot of these were using anodized sort of matte metal. Does the environment that you're putting these places in, or like the surrounding area, or the interactions with lighting have any effect on the choice of material that you choose to put in them, versus like wood versus aluminum panel or glass and things like that? Is there any sort of correlation, or is it just you kind of moved away from wood and then transitioned into this other?
So this is a great problem.
Yeah.
In that I think the decisions have grown very organically around what is at hand, because part of what you're seeing here is the evolution of a set of questions that have not really been clear until the work is done. So I think that the first engagement with wood had to do with a real desire to move away from craft, and which is kind of ironic under the circumstances, but to move away from the handmade, but to also step away from mass production. I was interested in the 4x8 sheet. It seems like a kind of ubiquitous building material, and I was interested in the possibility of mass customization. And that seemed like a very malleable, simple material to manipulate. But in fact, as time's gone on, it seemed that that decision had a lot of overtones that perhaps were not intended. And I think that now rethinking the possibility of returning to that material would require a whole new set of terms. But I think it's a very, very interesting problem.
So this is more of like an art historical question. So such that you're kind of like opening up spaces, it kind of like creates a distinction between like the viewer who has like this distinct view from this one perspective, opening up to someone who might be on a second floor who's then being viewed. I kind of wondered if you thought about your work as it relates to like voyeurism, or kind of that idea of like the spectator and the spectator.
So I love the problem of voyeurism, and I love the possibility of understanding the power and the power associated with gaze and issues of public and private, issues of jurisdiction, to enter this work. At the same time, I think when you ask this question and I think about this problem, I always think of Warhol, and in particular what I think about Warhol is that in some ways Warhol holds up a mirror to the world, and you read into that mirror what you see. And that is how I feel a little bit about the possibility of prescribing those relationships of voyeurism to the work. Hi, nice to see you.
So my question is about kind of your presentation. You have a lot of control over all the elements going on in the gallery, even down to the curation of what the viewer is seeing. And I'm super curious about when those things break down, I guess, when like you do not have any more control over those areas. What do you think about that? Like, do you try to play with that, or do you try to limit that?
I love it when there is a lack of control, but I also find that it leads to strange surprises. And what I mean by that is, I think the lack of control is perhaps the most interesting thing, because that's where I learn. And at the same time, the surprises are things that have to do with, for example, how air might flow, how sound might flow. Often what you're seeing is not entirely obvious, and how people will sort of want to see or not want to see, or if something is blocking it. But I do try to predict as much as possible prior to finding those unexpected conditions.